So, at some point, all of us have asked ourselves, or will ask ourselves, what does all this stuff mean? Ancient names, ancient places, ancient writing patterns, stories. Why does it matter? It was all so long ago. What difference could it possibly make to me in 2017? So I just want to remind you, nothing new, what the difference is. You know, when we begin a fairy tale a long time ago in a kingdom far, far away, automatically our eyes glaze over, we suspend reality, and we get lost in Never Never Land. And that makes the giant climbing up the beanstalk and the wicked stepmother and the princess letting her hair down from the castle easier to accept. There's nothing to question, nothing to object to. It's just a story. And that would be fine and dandy if that's what the Book of Mormon was or is. We could read the Book of Mormon, especially to our children, as we tuck them into bed. Pleasant stories, morality plays, fiction. Nephi, I want to take you into the mind of Nephi just for a moment. He understood the importance of making his record real. And I say that with confidence because he actually wrote in his introduction to the first book of Nephi a description, an overview of what the book contained, and part of it he says, they take their families and depart into the wilderness, their sufferings and afflictions in the wilderness, and then he says, the course of their travels. Why would he say that? Why would it be important to mention directions? Nephi knew that directions were vital to his record. And incidentally, his account goes on to record very specific directions for every stage of the journey until they reach the New World. So he fulfills his own statement by doing that. And he was not alone in doing that amongst the Book of Mormon record keepers. A great nation needs to have its setting incorporated into the account of its founding to make it real and to make sense to the reader. For example, Mormon, long after editing this huge collection of records, inserted about 570 words in Alma 22, clarifying the features of the land, because he realized that without some sort of place in the real world, it was too hard to follow. And so they have become part of nearly 1,000 passages in the Book of Mormon that have some geographical significance. Now, this morning I talked about the very beginning of the Book of Mormon and how it played out and how far we've come in understanding it. We have an almost complete and totally defensible geography for the old world setting. So I don't want to belabor that point, but what we now need to do, of course, is move on to the New World setting. And bridging the Old World setting and the New World setting, of course, was that great ocean voyage in which Nephi's ship, which was not built after the manner of men, sailed for surely a year or more. So regardless of whether they sailed eastwards, which is what I personally believe, or southwards and westwards and then northwards, the voyage is a major event, a major aspect of the Book of Mormon that we still have a lot to learn about. And so that brings us to the very end of the Book of Mormon, of course, Mormon's hill Kimora, which was the Jaredite hill Ramah, according to the statement of these compilers. The location of the great final battles, the great repository of all of the Jaredite and Nephite records, including, we presume, the plates that the prophet Joseph Smith translated. Over the last 4 decades, I simply didn't have the resources myself to focus on both the Old and the New World setting. I chose the Old World primarily because no one else was doing anything there. But I also did begin to become familiar with the New World setting back in the 1980s, my first visit to Mexico, purely as an LDS tourist, was in the mid-late 80s, and I've been back to the region many times since. I've tried to keep abreast of developments. I was saddened, like many of you would have been, with what happened to farms. And it's how its promise was subverted. But like most of you, I hope, I've rejoiced to see farms reborn, and the creation of Book of Mormon Central by the same person with new safeguards in place to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself. So Jack Welsh, I don't know if Jack's still here, probably not, but he, of course, is the genius behind the resurrection of farms. So we all owe him, of course, a great debt. The day-to-day operations, of course, as you know, are directed by Kirk Magleby, and he is, in my strongly held opinion, the foremost scholar in the church today in connection with Book of Mormon geography, which as a generalist, I think that's all I can say about myself, that would be how I categorize him. It's no secret that controversy about where the Book of Mormon took place in the New World has intensified in recent years. And some very long discredited ideas have had new life breathed into them on several fronts. In the interest of time, I'll pass over some of what I was going to say on that. But as a result, defining the New World setting of the Book of Mormon has not been gaining much consensus in recent years, and I believe the time has arrived that that is going to change. I believe it's already changing. Book of Mormon Central and its components are now the center of a reinvigorated Book of Mormon Study Center. Last year, I proposed to BMC a project. And my idea was that we need to fully investigate on the ground, not just on Google Earth, but on the ground, each of the locations that have been proposed for Kimora by both LDS and by Community of Christ researchers in Mesoamerica. There are actually 7 of them. All of them fall into central and southern Mexico. So again, we get back to Joseph Smith's statement about proving contraries. And yes, I'm very well aware that there are other proposals, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, Nicaragua, but we determined that at this point, those settings are too far from the most plausible New World settings. For the same reason, we have decided not to pursue proposals that have been made for settings in the USA, in Malaysia, in Peru, Sri Lanka, India, how many of you have heard of that one? And Africa, and so on. Now, these 7 Mesoamerican settings in Mexico have never all been visited, explored, and compared. At least 2 of them have never been visited, actually, by LDS researchers on the ground. And my thinking was simply this, that what worked with finding Nahom and what worked with finding Bountiful in the Old World should work in the New World. And so I thought if we can begin to anchor the New World setting by having at least a fully plausible candidate for this hill Rama or Kimora, that should, in turn, eventually let us move ahead in firming up the whole New World setting. So obviously the first step was to define the scriptural criteria for Kimora, the descriptors of the hill that we find in the text. And very encouragingly, Rama Kimora, and I'll just say Kimora from now on, has more criteria than the Old World Bountiful. And so as a result of that, there's a lot of criteria lists floating around, and I'm sure many of you, most of you, will have seen them. Some of them don't vary very much from others. But I'm going to be leaving some time this afternoon because Kirk is going to be speaking to us about that aspect of this project, the criteria for Kimora. Now, it would be nice if we could announce today that we have located the most plausible candidate for Kimora. That's not going to happen. It's still very much a work in progress. We began last year, but I believe that we've made some significant progress, and I want to talk to you about why I feel comfortable saying that. So first of all, last fall in October, we had our first team go to Central America and spend 3 weeks. And Alejandro, where is he? There he is down there waving, was a part of the team. He provided guidance, driving, security, and so on, communication. So what we did, we began in the state of Tamaulipas, which is north of Veracruz, and it runs all the way up to the US border, where there are a lot of problems, but in the southern part of the state, we found it was quite safe. And the very first candidate hill that we went to was Cerro Bernal. This hill is quite unusual and quite striking, more so because it sits in the middle of a totally flat landscape for many, many miles. It's been proposed and is proposed by Jerry Ainsworth, and I haven't seen Jerry here today, but many of you will be aware of him and know of his writing. So it's an unusual peak. It's basically bare rock in a flat landscape, and it juts up about 2,000 feet. Now, around the base, you can see there's a layer of jungle. And I'm reliably informed, because there are 1 or 2 people here today who shall remain nameless, that if you can survive the jaguars and the man-eating spiders in the jungle, it's quite the climb. And no, we didn't attempt. Now, Jerry's thinking is that the plateau, rather than the bare summit, which can be climbed but only with extreme difficulty and great danger, that the plateau surrounding the hill is the place referred to in Mormon's account when he writes that after the great final battle, the 24 survivors beheld, quote, on the morrow, unquote, that the Lamanites had returned to their camps and they could see the thousands of their dead who had been slain. So a most interesting hill. Mexico seems to be blessed in abundance with interesting topography. I don't know why that is, but it must be something to do with the geology of the area. But that was the first candidate hill that we visited and spent, I think, 2 days there. Next, we began moving south into Veracruz State, and we visited 2 locations that were proposed by Brother Larry Paulson from Texas, and I don't know if Larry's here today. Apparently not. I haven't met him, so I don't know what he looks like, but he did a lot of research. He's a retired university professor and did a lot of research on Google Earth. And the first of these is a semicircular range of hills called Otontepec. Now, that was basically the best image I could get of the hills. And what's of interest here is a town near these hills called Tepetzintla. Now, this is right off the tourist trail, even for local tourism. It's a very conservative, original, untouristy type of place. But the name Tepetzintla means something like Corn Mountain. And at this point, I hope all of the Spanish-speaking people will nod. Thank you. And that could be significant because the Book of Mormon hill Shim, where the records were stored before they were transferred to Kimora, has the meaning of Corn Hill. So somewhere near Kimora there must be a hill that could have been Shim or Corn Hill. However, Brother Paulson later, after making this proposal about Otontepec, found what he considered to be a better candidate, and that's another range of hills, not too far distant actually, and that's called Ometepeto. These slightly more rugged, but what a beautiful place. When I got there, I felt this is where I want to come when I retire. The countryside is green, it's clean. Again, it's not spoiled by commercialism. The town in the center of it is called Misantla, if anyone knows the area. And we've got a couple of people here today who are from that general area. And the hills are actually quite impressive. We actually climbed the highest of these hills, Ometepeto. And in the second view here, and there you see, that's looking precisely south. That's the town of Misantla in the distance. Beautiful place. I can recommend it. No, I'm not selling real estate or anything, but if you ever want to go to somewhere untouched in southern Mexico, try that. The peak on the right, you see the very prominent peak there, that's called La Espadilla. And that has a small archaeological site called Pahil. And this is actually the legendary place where corn originated. So again, we have a potential connection with Corn Hill. A very, very enjoyable place. We had to drag our driver away from it to keep to our itinerary. We now move on to another hill, which is most interesting. This is Cerro Rabanne. This is actually in the state of Oaxaca. And if you know your Mexican geography, if you go down to southern Veracruz and then turn left to the west, you go into Oaxaca state. Now, Cerro Rabanne is probably the most impressive of these candidates visually. It's a part of a range of mountains, as you can see there, very high, almost permanently clouded over on the summit. And they have been proposed as the Hill Kimora by a Community of Christ group called the Hill Kimora Expedition Team. They have a website. They're based in Missouri. Now, they're around 6,000 feet high at the highest point. Now, the story behind this candidate and bringing us up to date is quite fascinating. Ultimately, this candidate resulted from explorations in Mexico by an RLDS archaeologist that some of you will have heard of, Neil Steed. Now, he's been poking around down there since the 1970s, and he took a tour group of RLDS people there in 2001. And they became very interested and decided to organize a group, the Hill Kimora expedition team, and began serious exploration the following year, 2002. And essentially, they've been going back at least once a year since then. Now, to bring it up to date, they have a website, so it's easy to follow. They now claim a bunch of other locations. In fact, almost everything in the Book of Mormon, New World setting, they claim that they have located. But to keep the focus on Kimora, they claim that there they have found Mormon's tomb, and they believe they found an inscription that may have been made by Moroni on a stone tablet. And they've even made a provisional translation of the tablet, and it's known by them as the Proclamation Tablet. So it's all very interesting stuff. I was not aware of it until last year when I began focusing on this. But what's interesting about Cerro Rabanne is the fact that it is honeycombed with limestone sinks and cave systems. That's just a close-up of that same picture. And that's a photograph inside of one of the caves. Now, one of the cave systems in particular, which is the one that appears there, goes down over 3,000 feet. It's still not completely explored. There was a non-LDS cave exploration effort for some years from 1987 onwards. Now, visionary, I use the terminology, visionary underpinnings have driven the effort, and a couple of them I just want to note very quickly. First is a very detailed vision that Neil Steed claims to have been given of the final battle at Kimora. It's on their website. Don't read it before you just go to bed. Secondly is the introduction that he wrote for the testimony section, where he states that the Popol Vuh, the Mayan epic, the Mayan Bible, tells how the followers of the jaguar annihilated the followers of the Quetzal in a huge battle, and that both it and the Book of Mormon describe the battleground that fits blah, blah, blah. Now, of course, the Popol Vuh doesn't say any such thing about a battle or anything that could be interpreted as such, nor does any other early text, and of course, nor does the Book of Mormon. So I did contact them in fairness and sought clarification and politely asked about the Popol Vuh statement. I also talked with leading LDS authorities on Popol Vuh just to make sure I hadn't overlooked anything, but there's been no response. And after almost a year, I don't expect one now. And the website has remained unchanged as of yesterday. Associated with this and in the general area is another proposal by a gentleman called Eric Turner, also of the Community of Christ. He believes that Kimora will be found in the Rio Santo Domingo area. Okay, it's right in the very center, and I don't seem to have a pointer, or maybe I do, but it's right in the very center there, not too far from Cerro Rabanne. I have had contact with him and asked him about Cerro Rabanne. He doesn't rule it out, but he doesn't at this stage nominate a specific location. And that's just a picture of the lake system there, and this actually feeds into the Papaloapan system that goes all the way to the coast. And that's a view that not many of us would have seen. We've all seen pictures of the Papaloapan system, which is what we think is possibly Ripliancum, but this is what it's like further inland. Now, this is one that all of you will have heard of, Cerro Vejia in Veracruz. Many of you will have visited it. It's been the favored candidate for the Hill Kimora amongst most LDS scholars for some years. That's a Google Earth vertical view looking directly down on the hill, and to the right you can see the town Santiago Tuxtla. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on that because so much is known about it. This is a view of the summit of the hill in one of the rivers, the Topango. Because it fits most of the criteria quite easily, it's been believed, it's believed to have been, let me say that again. It has been accepted quite readily as the probable hill Kimora. That's a view taken just on some of the lower slopes to give you an idea of the terrain and the vegetation. And finally, but by no means last, the other candidate hill that we investigated arrived rather unexpectedly actually during this expedition, this 3-week trip. And it's a hill that many of you will not have heard of. It's Cerro San Martin, so it's a hill, San Martin Pahapan. Now, you need to be careful because there is a large active volcano called San Martin, normally Volcan or Volcano San Martin. This is not the same hill. Now there's again Google Earth with Cerro San Martin right in the middle, slightly up, and you can see it's quite near the coast. Now, this is still in the Tuxtla area. Now, this was first brought to our attention by Kochs. It's about 4,000 feet high. And what's interesting, I think, in many ways, is that historically and archaeologically, almost nothing is known about it. I haven't found any archaeological studies yet. That's a view of the hill. So you can see it's large. And that's a view of it from the coast, from the seashore. So it's a very dominant hill. On the very summit of the hill, this monument, the statue was found, and you can see the original in the museum in Jalapa, which is probably the second premier museum in Mexico, second only to the Mexico City Museum. It's a statue it's an Olmec statue dated to approximately 1000 BC. And so the implications are quite interesting if this was to be the hill Kimora. Now, just as southern Oman has the only area of fertility on the Arabian coast and is thus the only possible area where Nephi's bountiful could be, I believe that the evidence thus far is that the Tuxtla volcanic plateau in southern Veracruz is the best example of the geographical and climatic features mentioned by Mormon and by Moroni in connection with the hill Rama or Kimora. And the pattern is the same in both places. Once you see it in that sense, they actually seem quite obvious. So here's a radar map of the Tuxtla Plateau. You'll notice Lake Catamarco in the middle, a large lake. To the right, you'll notice the isolated mountain. That's Pahapan. And if on the lower left, that's Cerro Vehia. And so both hills occupy a roughly corresponding position. Lake Catamarco, of course, many of you will have visited. It may well play into the Book of Mormon story quite significantly as a source of food, protein for a large number of people. And this is another map showing the same information from a different angle, vertical angle. So Pahapan is down on the lower right. Vahia is on the upper left. So they are significant. Now, last month we had a second team return to the Tuxla areas, and that's where our current focus remains. Things are moving forward. We have found a lot of new information, but I just want to close by saying this, that we are not closing our eyes to other possibilities. If new information were to emerge, then we will look at it, regardless of where it is. We're happy to go back and re-examine other candidates. We're not locked into a particular candidate or even to the Tuxlas. In the end, all that matters is finding the truth. And I believe that what we're doing now is taking some steps towards that process of doing all that we can, and then we can expect that the Lord will give us more. So at this point, that's the area of focus. So stay tuned. I'd now like to invite Kirk to come up. Kirk will discuss with you, I'll let him introduce his own topic, but he will discuss with you the aspect of the criteria in this project.
Okay, when you go to Mesoamerica to start looking for Book of Mormon connections, you've got to do an expedition. So I'm going to put on my expedition hat. We had 4 of us that went down and spent a week, and then Warren spent an extra 2 weeks. So he was down there for 3 weeks. Those of us that had to come back to day jobs and so forth, we were only there for a week. But this expedition that we just got back from consisted of Javier Tovar, leading LDS archaeologist from Mexico, Doug Christensen, one of the longtime Book of Mormon aficionados, enthusiasts, and scholars from Twin Falls, Idaho, and myself, and then, of course, led by Warren Aston. What came out of this precisely follows the methodology that Warren explained this morning that was successful for him in finding the 2 incredible sites that we have in the Old World. And that is that you gradually refine your criteria, and then you go get boots on the ground, and then you go through another iteration on the criteria, and then you go back again, and then you're processing this positive feedback loop. This is what we found, this is what we think the text means, and so forth. We've gone through that process now, and last night we had a meeting at my house that consisted of the 4 of us that were on the 2017 Kimora expedition, and this is the criteria that we've come up with. We believe that this is a plausible way to interpret the text in such a way that we can come up with a list of things that we should be looking for to find the hill. And when Warren first came to me with the proposal, let's go see if we can find the hill Kimora, I was very intrigued because he said, you know what, we ought to be able to find a hill. And he's got a point. If there's anything left of the Book of Mormon, it's probably going to be a natural feature like a hill. So it's not a bad place to start, to go see if we can find it. And the Book of Mormon has a lot to say about it. So this is the consensus criteria of the 4 individuals just mentioned of what we think we're looking for in the hill Rama Kimora. Proximity to the waters of Ripley Ancam. This is coming out of Ether 15. Probably south from Ripley Ancam. That's coming out of 1510. Proximity to the hill Shim, which is coming out of Mormon 1.3, Mormon 4.23, and Ether 9.3. Probably westward. Shim was probably in westward direction from Kimora, and that's coming out of Ether 9.3. And then there's a natural barrier. The Book of Mormon talks about having to cross over. That's Mormon's shorthand for saying there's either a river or a mountain between these 2 points. You have to cross over something to get from Shim to Kimora. That's Ether 9.3. Then there was some sort of a comparative advantage to the Nephites in being around Hill Kimora, which is why Mormon says we did seek for some kind of advantage over the Lamanites. And that's coming out of Mormon 6.4. Well, what could those advantages be? This is the consensus now of this particular group of what those advantages would have been. Number, a military strategy and tactics, topography, sight lines, transportation corridors, impassable areas such as swamps, land cover, trees, seasonality, military equipment, access to weapon-grade material, chert, obsidian, that type of thing. Logistics, the carrying capacity of the land, the effort required to feed, clothe, and house the Nephite population, therefore giving them some extra time to go up and build fortifications or to arm themselves or whatever. Culture, allies, potential allies, which the Nephites had none of at the end. Traditions, taboos, the ecology, dependable rainfall, the fact that there's an intrinsic advantage to the defenders, which they then had, and the no need for long supply lines. It's important to look for an area that would have had two enemies. We should be able to define what those two enemies were, because Mormon is explicit there in the end, saying in Mormon 1:18, 2:8, 2:27, 2:28, Mormon 8:9, all talks about two different enemies, the Lamanites and the robbers. Eastward from the hill is the sea. That's coming out of Ether 9:3. We determined that Kimora is probably quite close to the sea. There's probably not a great deal of distance in between that. And that's coming out of our interpretation of Ether 9:3 in two different senses. Number one, the fact that there is no crossover involved, as there had been in the previous two phrases. And number two, that there's not many days, or the whole days thing doesn't appear in here, which is the way that Mormon typically describes some sort of a journey, unless he actually uses the word journey explicitly. We then should be able to go to a land of many waters, rivers, and fountains, and this is absolutely essential. I mean, this has got to be there. Mesoamerica in general is a well-watered area relative to Utah or Pinoche, Nevada. On the other hand, what we should be looking for is an extraordinarily well-watered area, something that is unusually abundant in surface features. There should be more surface water and more rainfall than in the immediately surrounding lands. Then fountains was interesting, because it turns out that fountains could be springs. There's certainly lots of springs in the part of the world that we're looking at, but they could also be waterfalls. And there are some folks down there locally who do call a fuente a waterfall, a cascada or salto de agua. We should find evidence of two cultures in the area. The Jaredites and the Nephite/Lamanites. We don't think that Nephite culture will be very distinguishable from Lamanite culture. So we tend to put those two together and say Nephite-Lamanite was one culture, Jaredite was another. But there should be two cultures in the area, probably two languages, and there might be two physical types or racial types in the actual physical features of the people today. Furthermore, the older of the two cultures, in our case the Jaredites, was larger demographically. We get that from Ether 15:2. Both cultures should have been literate. We get that from Mormon 2:17, Ether 1:2. This was a hill, not a mountain. We think that's a very important distinction, and we think there are other hills that are mentioned, other mountains that are mentioned in the text, and we should be able to distinguish what are the different factors between what constitutes a mountain as opposed to a hill. So we're getting this out of Ether 15:11, Mormon 6:2. We would expect that there may be mountains nearby, which would offer the sort of a visual contrast that Mormon is famous for in his text. Kimora is always referred to in the singular, implying some sort of a self-contained or an isolate or some kind of a discrete feature as opposed to a part of a continuous chain. We know we're in the land northward, so whatever geographic model we come up with has to have this thing located in the land northward. We would expect a la Jerry Ainsworth, Jerry Grover would expect a land susceptible to volcanic and or seismic activity, 3 Nephi chapter 8. However, there's a lot of ashfall in the area of the Tuxtlas. And so we would also expect that this would be an area not subject to an active volcano, which could then come in and completely cover over the Nephite repository. We don't think Mormon would have located a repository in a place that was going to be, in the next few hundred years, likely to be completely covered over with sort of Mount St. Helens kind of an ashfall. And there's a lot of that going on in this area. The hill was a significant landmark in the sense that both the Nephites and Lamanites knew to go there from a long distance at the appointed day. There were two names associated with this hill, which again implies it's a significant place. We think the hill was of medium height, tall enough so the survivors had cover and views of the large field of battle, as in Mormon 6:11, but low enough that wounded men could climb it in a few hours and view the destruction at lower levels of elevation, as also in Mormon 6. We think the hill was generally circular in shape. We get that from Mormon 6:4. There was probably some symmetry to the actual shape of the hill. And there was probably some steepness, verticality, especially at the top. And we're getting that from our interpretation of the likely scenario at the end where we have the survivors climbing up and then being able to see a broad field. Now this is important. There's a certain space that this hill must occupy. The hill was large enough to accommodate, as a minimum, 500,000 people in the vicinity, in the area of battle, because we had 230,000 actually mentioned in the text, and then we had many more of that coming in from the invading forces between the combination of the robbers and the Lamanites. We then have, we possibly could have up to 750,000 people needed to be accommodated. There's a certain amount of size, and that's going to be somewhere north of 1,000 hectares, and could be up as high as in the neighborhood of 2,000 hectares minimum that we've got to be able to find in the hill, which completely rules out lots of hills that have been proposed that are way too small. We then have a bunch of other stuff, population density, caves. We've got an interesting situation with the security situation around Hill Shim, because Mormon explicitly goes in and says, there came a point when, even though Ammoron told me, I hid these plates up to the Lord, and Ammoron expected that they would remain in the Hill Shim forever, and Mormon says, you know what, the Lamanites come in and took over the place. We no longer control the area around Hill Shim. There's been a radical change in the political and security situation. I, therefore, had to go disobey Ammoron and take the plates and move them over to the new Kimora. We should be able to find that kind of a thing. That's the kind of stuff that archaeologists are capable of telling us. We have a escape route southward. Obviously, a massive warfare. There's ways we can test that. And then this is a problem because the 43 Limhi explorers found bones. And we know how long a bone that's simply heaped up in this kind of a climate is going to last. And it's not going to last more than 100 years. There's no way. You'll have complete skeletal decomposition within 100 years in virtually any part of this part of the world that's in this tropical kind of an area. So that gives us some timing, because we know that the Limhi explorers were going in there in about 120 BC. We then have the fact that there's another hill. There are 9 hills mentioned in the text, okay? And one of those hills has an interesting name. It's got the hill Riplah. And the onomasticon tells us that the very likely meaning of this RBL or RPL is very large. So Hill Riplah was probably a very large hill. So we would think in any given geography that Riplah should be larger than Kimora because of that linguistic feature. We then have some more things about the view. This one was very interesting. We have the Nephites who are going north, 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 and then there comes a point, they get as far north as Shem, which is the furthest northern advance, and then they can't go north anymore, and they're going to go back and fight the final battle southward. And then they escape to the south. What's going on that prevents the Nephites from just going north forever? Why can't they just get out of Dodge? Just leave and move north, because there had been a tendency to move north now for the last several hundred years. And there's plenty of northward migration talked about in the text, some of which went so far away they lost contact. They went off the radar screen. Nonetheless, there's something going on here where they cannot just, Mormon can't just take the Nephites and just continue to go north. So we think we should be able to find that archaeologically. Then we've got some interesting comparisons between the Limhi explorers, because when they go to, hello honey bunch, I love you. When the Limhi explorers go to find the remnants of the Jaredite Holocaust, they come back and report to King Limhi, we found Zarahemla. There may be some interesting correlations between Zarahemla geographically and Kimora geographically. There are others, but these are the criteria. We have 33 that we've come up with several subpoints, and we believe this is an important characteristic up to this point. We think we know what we're looking for. Thank you.